So, welcome to our keynote panel for the 2026 Farbindungen conference. We are going to begin shortly with a few welcoming words, and then we will hand it over to our moderator for the panel, Elena Hoffenberg. But to begin with, I'd like to welcome Dr. Orit Bashkin, the director of the Greenberg Center at the University of Chicago, to say a few words for us.
Okay, so I'll keep it short, but I just wanted to welcome you all on the behalf of the Greenberg Center that played a role in funding this conference. We are very, very excited to have and to be able to participate in this conference that has such a global attendance. I noticed that participants are coming from Amsterdam and from New York and from Harvard and from Sao Paulo. And I think it reflects the sort of dynamism that is typical of Yiddish studies. I also wanted to note that Yiddish studies is very important to both the Greenberg Center and the University of Chicago, where Yiddish is being taught. In such departments as Germanic studies, comparative literature, history, as both a research language and also a language rich with its own literature and cultural production. This is also an opportunity for me to thank the faculty members of the University of Chicago that participate in this conference, the wonderful Jessica Curzin, who is doing so much to promote Yiddish studies in our university, Ken Moss from the history department, and Elena Torres from comparative literature. I also want to welcome, in particular, our keynote speakers who are coming to us. Miriam Udel, who comes to us from the University of Emory, and most recently published Honey on the Page, a treasury of Yiddish children literature. And it's also an opportunity for us to congratulate her for being the winner of the Independent Press Award for the religious category and for being shortlisted for the National Jewish Book Award in non-fiction. We also wanted to congratulate and welcome Caroline Luce, who is the project director at the UCLA Institute for Research on Labor and Employment's Memory Work Initiative and the author of Yiddish in the Land of the Sunshine, Race, Labor, and Yiddish Radicalism in Los Angeles. In this moment in American history, we're also very, very happy that there's actually a conference that is dedicated to labor issue, radicalism, and its political and literary and cultural manifestations. So thank you so much for having this conference. We're delighted that you're here. We just wanted to wish everybody who participate to have a wonderful day. I'm the granddaughter of Yiddish speakers, but if I would congratulate you in Yiddish, I would butcher every word. My specialty is Arabic, so you'll forgive me about that, although I can follow some of the things that you're saying. And I hand it over to the panel. So again, welcome. We're delighted and enjoy the rest of the conference. Also, many, many thanks to Mike Phillips and Mike Lester from the Greenberg Center of Jewish Studies, who did a lot of work together with Jessica, together with the team organizing the conference. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Bashkin, for the warm welcome from the Greenberg Center. My name is Elena Hoffenberg. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago, and I work on the Jews of Interwar Poland, which means that I get to live and love in Yiddish. Seid begrüßt euch allemen in der Keynote von Farbindungen. I will be introducing our two speakers, Miriam Udel and Caroline Luce. I will give the bios before each presentation. So if you arrive in the middle, you are obviously not here to hear this, but you will not miss the bio if you come in the middle. So Miriam Udel is Associate Professor of German Studies and the Judith London Evans Director of the Tam Institute of Jewish Studies at Emory University. She holds an A.B. in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations and a PhD in Comparative Literature, both from Harvard University, and was ordained in 2019 at Yeshivat Maharat. Udel is the author of Never Better, The Modern Jewish Picaresque from University of Michigan Press, and most recently, Modern Jewish World-Making Through Yiddish Children's Literature, which was published last year by Princeton University Press. Additionally, Miriam Udel is the editor and translator of Honey on the Page, a treasury of Yiddish children's literature published by NYU Press. Her research looks to children's literature and culture as a powerful force for political formation and a resource for the intergenerational transmission of culture, values, and ideology. And we'll see this put into practice through her keynote address entitled The Group Was the Work, Two Visions of Work, Rest, and Relationality in Yiddish Children's Literature.
Thank you so much, Elena, for the kind introduction. I can't really put into words how excited I am about the existence of Farbindungen in general, and therefore how grateful I am to be part of this keynote panel with Dr. Luce. I feel like you collectively out in cyberspace, though I cannot see you, I see your names and I feel your presence. You are the present and the future of Yiddish studies. And Farbindungen, and I'll also mention, particularly because of some of those who are in this virtual room, in Geweb, these are the institutions that really push back on narratives of inexorable decline and attrition that have attached to Yiddish. And it's such a privilege to be able to teach and share ideas in this space. So what I argue in my most recent book, Modern Jewish World Making Through Yiddish Children's Literature, is that the corpus of almost 1,000 standalone books, as well as anthologies and periodicals, sometimes several decades long runs of periodicals written for children in Yiddish, constitute a window onto almost everything modern and Ashkenazi. So I have a whole spiel about that I'm not going to give today because we want to keep to 20 minutes. But I wanted to make sure that I really tailored today's remarks to the theme, the conference theme of Yiddish at Work. Now, even that, there's so much to say within my recent and current research. I'm not going to tell you about the songbirds of the forest who withhold their labor of song as a protest on behalf of their caged cousins in the city. Nor am I going to tell you at any great length about Doggy Labzik and his existential desire to be of use. In fact, today I am going to restrict myself to speaking about material with human protagonists. The through line for me in choosing the two texts that I am going to share, and they are texts, and I'll explain the air quotes in a moment, is actually the forest as a setting, which is in Yiddish literature, not only in Yiddish literature, but also in Yiddish literature, a site of liminality, sometimes of danger, but always of uncertainty and possibility. So I want to invite you into the Yiddish forest to talk about two different models of work, rest, and relationality. Now, the first is a text, no air quotes needed. It is a short story by Yankiv Fichman. Bear with me, I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. And because he is perhaps an unfamiliar figure to many, or a slightly familiar figure, I'm going to start out, once I get this to advance, by sharing some quick bullet points about his life. So his dates are 1881 to 1958, and when he is remembered, it is usually as Yaakov rather than Yankiv Fichman, and he is remembered as a cultural Zionist, which he was, and one of the founding fathers of Israeli modern Hebrew children's literature, and particularly the Hebrew lullaby. So whether people know it or not, if they had any sort of Yaldut Israelit, Israeli childhood, they probably at some point were sung to sleep by one of Fichman's lullabies. He's born and educated in Bessarabia. He spends time in Bialik Circle in Odessa and then in Warsaw as a young man. He emigrates to pre-state Palestine in 1912, comes back for a visit in Europe, and like so many other artists and writers, gets stranded by the blockade during the Great War. And as I said, he's known for lyric poetry and children's poetry, mostly in Hebrew, but a little bit in Yiddish. And he wrote this absolutely gorgeous story with which I opened my 2020 anthology, Honey on the Page, A Sabbath in the Forest. And just to give you a little bit of the texture of his Yiddish, because so many of you will appreciate it, I'll read a couple of lines. Amol is gewesen a Yid in a klein Städtel, a Yid a Schneider, hat geheißen Lippe, Lippe der Schneider. Is der Doseker Lippe gewesen a posheter Yid, kein Davenen gekannt. Und a größer Ohrenmann, nicht für keinem gedacht, nur das Ohrenstückel Bräut für sich und sein Weib Nechome mit die Kinderlach hat verdient, zu leiten Cholile nicht angekommen. To give that to you in English, once upon a time there lived a Jewish tailor in a small shtetl. He was known as Lipa the tailor. He was a simple Jew who barely knew all the prayers, and he was very poor. Shouldn't happen to anyone. But he managed to earn a crust of bread for himself, his wife Nechama, and their children, and he never, God forbid, had to accept charity. From Sunday until Friday, all week long, he traveled well beyond the shtetl, going from village to village, and the Yiddish there is Dorf, hamlet with mostly non-Jewish residents, doing jobs for the peasants, sewing, patching, turning coats. Lipa wasn't picky. Just imagine what he suffered during the week. That's why come Friday, thank God, you could offer him the most profitable job, but Lipa the tailor headed home no matter what. It could be thundering and lightning outside, but he had to make it back to his tidy little home to spend Shabbos, the Holy Sabbath, with his wife Nechama and their children, to recite the Kiddush blessing over the wine and sing Sabbath songs at the table as God had commanded. You see, the most important commandment for Lipa the tailor was to keep the Holy Sabbath properly. He believed that it was thanks to his keeping Shabbos that the Eternal One provided his bread for the week. And then it goes on to talk about one particular week when it's winter and he finishes his work early so that he can get home, and everyone knows that there's a snowstorm coming. This should be very relatable for some of the attendees right now, although perhaps not for me here in Atlanta. And all of the peasants who employ him throughout the week say, oh, don't risk it. You should stay over. Don't think about traveling in this weather. And Lipa says, I have a great God who will protect me and bring me home safely. He is absolutely determined to make it home in time for Shabbos. So he sets out early, and the snow begins to fall, and he's trudging along, and he makes it to the forest. And the forest looks something like this woodcut, and he loses the path, and it becomes whiteout conditions, and he can see that the sun is getting lower and lower over the horizon, and Sabbath is on its way. And finally, he has a decision to make when he's losing sight of the sun. Is he going to put down his pack because carrying it would be forbidden on the Sabbath and just stop, come what may, and pray the afternoon service? Or is he going to say, my life is in danger and I'm going to have to break the Sabbath in order to forge ahead with my pack and try to make it home? He decides to stop and daven mincha. And at the conclusion of his prayers, he looks up, and this magnificent edifice that you see in the illustration that looks something like an Eastern European synagogue, but is instead a marble palace, has loomed up before him where there was nothing a moment ago. And he thinks that there might be some dark magic at work. But then he spots two Sabbath candles in one of the windows, and he knows that this is good magic, that he's safe and he can go ahead into the palace. When he does so, he comes into chamber after chamber with tables set for a Sabbath feast, each more opulent than the last. He progresses from a room with silver accoutrements to a room with gold accoutrements to a room with precious stones, diamonds, etc., etc. He goes through 6 rooms, and when he enters the 7th room, instead of finding it empty, he's greeted by an elder who says, "Lipa the tailor, we've been waiting for you, come in." And there's a whole congregation of elders who are praying the Friday night service together. And Lipa joins them, and the songs are very familiar because they're exactly the ones that are sung in his shtetl. And the elders invite him to their meal, and the foods are very familiar because they are precisely the same kugel and cholent that his wife Nechama prepares every week. And he spends the most beautiful Sabbath of his life from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. Lipa the tailor enjoyed the kind of Shabbos we should all wish on each other. He only regretted that it had been without his wife Nechama and his children, whose Sabbath had surely been marred by his absence. But just as soon as the sun set on Saturday and the conclusion of the Sabbath was marked with the Havdalah ceremony and the entire palace disappeared, and Lipa saw that he was standing once again under the tree where he'd been the day before. His pack lay in its place and his walking stick was stuck in the snow. He took a few steps and, oh, where was the forest? What forest? He found himself standing in his town not far from his own cottage. Once home, Lipa kept quiet, didn't tell anyone where he had spent Shabbos. But from then on, whenever his wife Nechama would bring to the table her fragrant fish and tell him as usual, "Lipa, time for the fish, it has the taste of paradise," Lipa the tailor would smile to himself and reply, "Yes, yes, my Nechama, I've known for a long time that your Shabbos cooking has the true taste of paradise." And nobody else in their household knew quite what he meant by those words. So that is the end of Lipa the tailor. And the $64,000 question, when we put together that story and Yankov Pat's tale of the magic lion, where a rabbi is traveling through the desert with a caravan in similarly vulnerable circumstances, and Friday afternoon comes around and he has to make a similar kind of decision about whether to push on or whether to just stop and observe the Sabbath, and he does the latter and is befriended by a lion. I'll just give you the beautiful rendering by Paula Cohen of when the lion helps him to catch up to the caravan on Saturday night by having him hop on the lion's back. With both of these stories that are part of this micro-genre of Sabbatarian tales written by secularists, whether they are cultural Zionists like Fichman or Bundists like Yankov Pat, the $64,000 question is, why are secularists writing these tales that celebrate the Sabbath? And the answer that I arrive at is that they see the Sabbath as a technology of rest, and they sense and then further create a convergence point between something very old, something ancient, as a matter of fact, and something new, which is Bundist and other radical politics that say if 1/7 of the workers' time is reserved for ritual, is reserved for the Almighty, as it were, then that's 1/7 of their time that the workers have clawed back from the capitalist bosses. So we have these Sabbatarian tales. The Magic Lion unfolds in a desert, but of course, this one is the Sabbath that Lipa spends in the forest. And now I want to take you to a completely different forest that also has an opposition between work and rest, or more precisely, work and leisure. And this is where I really have to put text in quotation marks. And this is also furnished the title for my talk today, that the group was the work. So now I want to take you to the Medem Sanatorium, 17 kilometers outside of Warsaw, founded by Bundists in 1926 and operational until its liquidation by the Nazis in 1942 as a sanatorium, as the name suggests, a health facility, but more precisely a preventorium, an institution for the prevention of tuberculosis among Warsaw's urban Jewish, mostly Jewish, poor. This was a facility that children would be sent to, something like the Fresh Air Fund, usually for a stay of somewhere between 3 weeks and 3 months, where perhaps for the first time in their lives, they would have access to ample food, to fresh milk, plenty of bread and vegetables, medical care, a staff of doctors and nurses, novelties like toothpaste that not all of the children were familiar with, and new rituals like evening showers and toothbrushing, so hygienic rituals. And one of the most fascinating things about the Medem Sanatorium was that it was conceived and operated as a children's republic. So children formed committees and they voted on everything, including one of the sanatorium residents recalls they voted on whether to have spinach for dinner. And so when I talk about the Medem Sanatorium as a text, what I'm really drawing on here is a pair of children's books that were written by Yisrael Bieber, the nature instructor at the facility. They're called Winter in the Forest and Spring in the Forest. A fundraising film that was created and released in 1937, and a fundraising brochure that called How Children Live in the Medem Sanatorium. So now I'm going to come back and share my screen one more time. Get us out of the way again. Okay. So this is Winter im Wald, Winter in the Forest, and this is the diagram that showed how children governed themselves by committee. So there is a tree trunk that is the Kinderrat, the children's council, and there are all kinds of different concerns: culture, nature, hygiene, administration, and all of these have thicker and thinner branches. And from the youngest years, children arriving at the sanatorium would get funneled toward one of these committees. And as they got older and could be expected to demonstrate more leadership, they would sort of escalate toward the Children's Council. And on the left here, we see the Children's Republic in action. We have the Children's Parliament in its general weekly meeting on the left. These photos are drawn from the fundraising brochure. And on the right, we have the smaller, more elite Kinderrat, or Children's Council, which, as you can see, is made up of older children. There were 10 commandments at the Medem Sanatorium, a numbered list under the heading Sei gegrüßt, neu gekommener Chaver, greetings to you, newly arrived comrade, or as I now like to think of the word chaver after Elena Torres's delightful locution, chumrad, because it really brings in that sense of both friendship and comradeship. And now I want to just read you a brief passage from modern Jewish world making, where I talk about the attitude toward work and leisure. Inducting young children into a socialist consciousness entailed blurring the line between work and play. Nowadays, it is a truism among progressive early childhood educators that the work of childhood is play. But at Medem, it was almost equally true that the play of childhood was work, accorded the same dignity as adults' work. Work was not just an activity, but an identity, and the Sanatoristen were encouraged to identify as children of the workers. Children pulled weeds and harvested in the garden and orchard, folded and changed bed linens, mended clothing, polished shoes, and carried out many other necessary tasks. This approach was not unique to Medem, and in fact became quite prevalent in a variety of settings that extended from Montessori schools to Soviet kindergartens. However, because Medem was also conceived as a preventorium for children at risk of contracting tuberculosis, many of whom were weakened by malnourishment and lack of regular exercise, the push toward labor was also balanced by a cultivation of rest and leisure. Pleasure reading was celebrated as a leisure activity, and the library was one of the facility's most fondly remembered amenities. The collection of over 1,000 Yiddish and Polish books, bolstered by gifts from visiting dignitaries, was supported by a nominal monthly subscription fee of 20 groschen, waived for those who could not afford to pay. And so in these pictures, we have the children reading kind of restfully. And so I do have a little clip queued up from Mir Kommen On, the fundraising video, but I see that we are just about at time, and I want to kind of bring these stories side by side and summarize a little bit conceptually. So maybe we'll have an opportunity to come back for 90 seconds or 2 minutes of the portrayal of work in this film. But in the Sabbath in the Forest, Shabbos involved, work is something that takes place for Lipa away from home. And it's humble, but it's clean and manageable. In Mir Kommen On, the work of the city, which is to say all of the work that's not said at Medem, is at home, it's dirty, it's all-encompassing, it's overwhelming, it necessitates an escape for the children. Work that takes place at Medem, on the other hand, is age-appropriate and kind of, even when it involves cleaning something, it's more associated with the clean than with the dirty. For Lipa, the Sabbath acts as a counterweight to his workaday routine. For the Bundists at Medem, it's the sanatorium that acts as a counterweight to the ordinary drudgery of the children's lives. For Lipa, in a Sabbath in the Forest, there's very much a concept of Sabbath rest versus weekaday work, whereas at Medem, it's something a little bit more akin to work versus leisure. There is work. It's incredibly varied. It's always age appropriate. And then as far as relationships, and maybe this is something that we'll talk about more in the discussion, because I have a feeling that this is part of where this work will speak so well with Dr. Luce's, with Caroline's. Lipa is in relationship to the patrons who employ him in the villages, the peasants who are not Jewish, the elders that he meets at prayer, and Nechama and the children. And these are all fairly intimate, emotionally involved relationships. In the Medam Sanatorium, there are children's relationships with their parents, which of course are at a kind of secondary remove from the perspective of the sanatorium and its culture. There are the relationships that they develop with the teachers and the medical staff. And of course, there are the peer-to-peer relationships, which are represented in Bieber's books as warm and cordial, but not terribly intimate, almost as if they were professional relationships, which I think is really interesting. So we are at time, I believe. And so I'm going to stop talking now and look forward to the conversation that we will have together over the next hour or so after hearing from Dr. Luce.
Thank you so much, Dr. Udel. I will be introducing our next speaker, Dr. Caroline Luce, who is a project director with the UCLA Institute for Research on Labor and Employment's Memory Work Initiative. She previously served as the chief curator of Mapping Jewish LA, a project of the UCLA Levy Center for Jewish Studies, and is also chair of the communications committee of UCAFT, representing librarians and non-tenured faculty at the University of California. Her research specialty is immigration, labor, and working class culture in the American West. Her book, Yiddish in the Land of Sunshine, Race, Labor, and Jewish Radicalism in Los Angeles, will be published by NYU Press in 2026. Dr. Luce, the floor is yours. Oh, and the title of your talk is Red Chuppahs, Gender, Labor, and Jewish Radicalism in Los Angeles.
Yes, thank you so much. We're now traveling from the Yiddish forest, where it felt so cozy and warm with Miriam, to the land of sunshine. So I'm hoping you'll get some warmth coming from Southern California in this talk. Okay. On February 5th, 1919, the sheriff of San Bernardino and an armed posse of deputies conducted what they described as a deportation at a small cottage known as Russia House in Covina, 40 miles east of Los Angeles. A few weeks earlier, a group of 35 young men and women, described by the LA Times as Bolsheviki agitators, had taken up residence in the cottage and, as local citrus growers claimed, infiltrated the groves, stirring up trouble among the mostly Mexican and Japanese pickers as the yearly harvest began. Though state investigators would later verify that the citrus pickers were paid less than $3 a day and had, quote, died like flies from the Spanish flu, citrus growers insisted the agitators were entirely responsible for the workers' discontent, charging they had threatened the pickers with guns and planned to set the orange groves on fire. Days earlier, the sheriff's department arrested 6 of the residents of Russia House, including 22-year-old Esther Cooper, the, quote, daring and clever Jewess deemed to be the leader of the strike. But that had failed to stop the unrest, as work stoppages shut down orchards and packing houses in San Dimas, Laverne, Pomona, and Azusa. So after an emergency meeting in the morning, the local sheriff and his posse, accompanied by 400 area residents, drove to Russia House to remove the agitators once and for all. As the Times reported, the agitators were dragged out of the house and loaded onto a truck, and in a final act of defiance began singing the Marseillaise as the truck pulled away. A few hours later, they were, quote, unceremoniously dumped out in Boyle Heights. The deportation in Covina marked a seminal moment in the racialization of Yiddish-speaking Jews in Southern California, in which a variety of carceral and cultural practices converged to construct a new type of racialized other, the so-called Jewish Bolshevik. Echoing the rhetoric of the sheriff and his posse, coverage in local newspapers explicitly described the deportees as Russian Jewish or coded them as Jewish in more subtle ways, with references to their dark skin and very curly black hair. Their looks and their fashion choices, marking them as threatening and subversive foreign agitators, exogenous others who, quote, did not come to Covina to pick oranges, and therefore must be disavowed, punished, and removed. The scripting of race in Covina operated in 2 directions. By catastrophizing Jews' power to manipulate and coerce, they simultaneously denied the agency of the Mexican and Asian pickers, casting them as simple-minded victims of sinister Jewish plots. By raising the specter of the Jewish Bolshevik, the citrus growers reified the superiority of white Christians and their dominion over the citrus belt. And in turn, they fixed the gaze of anti-radical discourse and enforcement on the Russian Jewish population in Boyle Heights, where the deportees had been dumped out. What I hope to demonstrate today is that the deportation in Covina sits at the intersection of the themes of this conference, providing a crucial lens to explore histories of labor, gender, and Jewish radicalism in the Yiddish-speaking diaspora of Southern California. I'll be drawing from my forthcoming book, Yiddish in the Land of Sunshine, which will be released later this summer. Yay! And its central claim is that in the borderlands of the Southwest, both Jewish inclusion and Jewish otherness were intimately bound to the ideological and racial projects of American settler colonialism. For generations, American Jewish historians advanced linear narratives of Western exceptionalism, arguing that the uniquely fluid and multicultural landscape of the West enabled Jews to ascend to the highest ranks of civic and economic life. But more recently, historians have begun reckoning with the ways that Jews participated in and benefited from the American colonial project. Sherry Rabin, for example, has shown that Jews were afforded a, quote, unfettered mobility in the 19th century, including access to citizenship and financial credit because of the valuable roles they played in establishing market capitalism in the West. Jewish mobility was sometimes viewed with suspicion, resulting in laws that refettered their mobility, including during the Civil War. But such concerns were often outweighed by economic necessity, as through their familial and pecuniary ties to co-religionists, Jewish settlers provided vital linkages to markets and trade networks in larger cities. And that was certainly true in Los Angeles, where 8 Jewish merchants were counted in the first California census of 1850. These were mostly immigrants from Bavaria, Bohemia, and other parts of Central Europe, and most of them and other so-called pioneers of the 19th century found incredible success in LA. They grew their small stores into massive wholesale and retail trading enterprises, made wise investments in real estate and public utilities, and served at all levels of government, from mayor to water commissioner to county sheriff. So even as the Jewish population in LA remained very small, just around 2,500 at the turn of the century, Jews played outsized roles in local government and economic life because of their contributions to settler colonization, and as a result, were fully integrated into the emerging Anglo elite. Like other Anglo settlers, these Jewish pioneers had taken control of large swaths of land and natural resources, and to realize their ambitions for commercial empire building, pooled their funds to mount an aggressive promotional campaign to attract tourism and investment in the region, sponsoring guidebooks and magazines that presented Southern California as a modern-day Pueblo, where every resident could have a taste of the good life. Images like these positioned white settlers as harbingers of modernity, who had transformed an arid desert into a lush and lucrative paradise, and sublimated the contributions of the indigenous, Mexican, and mestizos workers upon whose labor that transformation depended. American settlement demanded a steady stream of migratory workers to fell trees, clear land, lay track, mine ore, and pick crops, drawing immigrants from all over the world to the region. And business owners in LA then took advantage of this pool of mostly disenfranchised, non-citizen migratory workers to enforce a racially segmented dual labor system, in which they employed exclusively efficient white workers in skilled positions and so-called peons, workers of Mexican and Asian as well as African American descent, in lower skilled, lower paying jobs. Some local employers referred to the practice as the Mexican wage. But workers are entirely absent in these images, right? The work of settlement is just done. It happens on its own. I grow these myself. The boosters' cultural representations of Southern California thus reinforce the racial logics of the dual labor system and the colonial project as a whole. And this settler imaginary became a crucial part of the boosters' pitch. Move your factory here and you can just lay back and relax in the land of sunshine, right? This guy's life is laid out before him. The fields are already tended to. So labor, or the absence of it, is embedded in this settler imaginary, but I would argue social reproduction is as well. Most boosters imagined home ownership as a virtuous bulwark against the vice, disease, and overcrowding that prevailed in the industrial metropolises of the East, a progenitor of self-reliance, individualism, and domesticity. And they used zoning and land use restrictions to engineer a new kind of decentralized, low-density urban landscape, where single-family homes would be available to elites and wage earners alike, and where white male breadwinners like this guy would work hard and have their own little homestead, and women could be these diaphanous goddesses. Notice this guy's wife isn't even in the picture. As founding members of the Chamber of Commerce and other booster clubs, Jews played a central role in this promotional campaign, both within the Jewish community and without. And it was incredibly successful. Los Angeles was, as one scholar put it, boosted into existence, the city's population increasing from less than 10,000 residents in 1870 to over 500,000 by 1920. Among these new arrivals were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. And in most accounts, they have been positioned in counterpoint to the pioneers that preceded them, a juxtaposition that lifts up the fact that working class Yiddish-speaking Jews often rejected the assimilation and profiteering of their elite brethren and brought with them distinct religious, cultural, and radical traditions, ones I document in my book. Most of these Eastern European rivals came to LA after 1905 and settled east of the LA River in Boyle Heights, a residential neighborhood that was once home to the highest concentration of Jews west of Chicago, as well as equally large numbers of Mexicans and a smaller group of Armenian, Turkish, Russian Moluccan, Japanese, and Italian immigrants, as well as a historic African American community. Historians have accordingly dubbed the neighborhood the Lower East Side of Los Angeles, or LA's Ellis Island. And as the traditional explanation goes, that diversity was owed to racial covenants. These were clauses written into mortgage agreements that prohibited landowners from renting or selling to persons who were not, in the language of the contracts, of the Caucasian race. By the end of World War I, something like 90% of housing stock in LA was governed by such racial covenants. And so the story goes, these excluded groups settled in the handful of neighborhoods that remained, including Boyle Heights. But whereas the neighborhood has traditionally been presented as a site of Jewish otherness, where and when Jews were ethnic, immigrant outsiders, my work also surfaces what I call the Western expectations of Yiddish-speaking Jews, how they absorb the boosters' romantic imagery of Southern California, as well as its attendant racial logics, and how that at times limited their solidarity. The history of Jewish labor organizing in LA reveals this limits. As in the industrial cities of the East, Jewish workers, particularly in the garment industry, played prominent roles in the local labor movement. LA was a notoriously anti-union town, and Jewish tailors were among the first to strike and win a union contract in 1910. It was a very big deal. But there were a couple key differences in the garment industry here as compared to New York. The first was Hollywood. By 1920, 80% of the films in the US were being made by 5 major studios in LA, and these studios were vertically integrated, meaning every aspect of production was done on site, including costume design. The studios hired the trendiest designers, who in turn opened up their own shops, and the stars themselves increasingly set the trends for the country. And the styles they chose were very different than that in the East. This description in the corner here comes from the 1940s, but it certainly applies earlier. And LA quickly became the epicenter of the production for these sun-inspired looks. Not high fashion like in New York or in Europe, more casual trends at lower price points made of cheaper and easier to produce fabrics, what we might call today fast fashion. The second key difference, of course, was that racial dual labor system that prevailed. The members of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the ILG, formed during that strike in 1910, were mostly custom tailors, cloak makers, and furriers whose solidarity was rooted in their status as expert craftsmen. But we simply don't wear a lot of furs and 3-piece suits and cloaks here in Los Angeles. And as the industry grew, most of the workforce came to be composed of so-called unskilled machine operators sewing these sun-inspired looks, most of whom were young women of Mexican descent. The older Yiddish-speaking male leaders of the union regarded these young women as seasonal and temporary workers, not skilled craftsmen. They repeatedly referred to them as girls, who were just there to earn some money before they got married and had babies, peons willing to endure any sort of treatment. Yiddish proved a key vector of their exclusion. The use of Yiddish may have been necessary to organize Jewish workers, but fundamentally excluded non-Jews from the union. And race was a factor as well. They simply didn't see las costureras as equal and reported they were impossible to organize. And this pattern of exclusion was repeated in other industries. Jewish bakers, carpenters, and painters formed their own Yiddish-based union branches that excluded non-Jewish members well into the 1950s. The result was significant socioeconomic disparities. Significant economic disparities within the neighborhood. A 1924 survey of Boyle Heights, for example, estimated that nearly 25% of the Jewish population was part of, quote, the aristocracy of the laboring class. That included union garment workers whose contracts provided relatively high wages, but that nearly half of the neighborhood's Mexican population worked as laborers who, quote, had nothing to offer but their bodily strength and were likely paid that Mexican wage. That meant Jewish residents had much higher rates of job stability. Almost 75% of Jews were reported to be regularly employed, as compared to less than half of workers from Italy and a third of workers from Mexico. And nearly 20% of Jewish residents were said to be employed in white-collar jobs, a higher percentage than even the American-born residents of the neighborhood. So were Jews in Boyle Heights working class? Certainly compared to their more elite brethren, yes. But compared to their non-Jewish neighbors, the answer to that question is often a bit more murky. Most came west after having already spent some years in the United States. They often brought with them some savings or a union card, and in combination with their skin color, that gave them advantages in navigating LA's racialized dual labor system. You can see these ambiguities around class reflected in the Yiddish literature published in the same years. Joseph Katzenogy's poem here, as well as this one by Lune Mates, are about achieving the good life promised by the boosters. Buying sunny cottages among the orange blossoms, towering mountains, and proud palms, flowers and vines and just cut green lawns. Then the authors point to the consequences of that mobility, the darker realities lurking just beneath LA's sunny surface, of longing, of loss of community, and eternal restlessness. The lonely troubadour playing for empty balconies, right? Now, I will say this is a very LA literary thing. Early 20th century writers in LA offered counterfables to the boosters, tales of newcomers and dream seekers and dashed hopes to expose the cracks in LA's sunny veneer. That style would later ripen into the hard-boiled noir of the 1930s and 40s. But these are not proletarian stories of hunger and hardship and suffering, right? They are stories of success and access to inclusion. Boyle Heights was over 80% single-family homes, sunny cottages with just-cut green lawns. Union garment workers could afford a house and maybe even a car of their own. They got a taste of that good life. Certainly, these poems point to the consequences of Jewish mobility, but as with their organizing practices, Yiddish writers rendered Boyle Heights a space for Jewish belonging, but not a multiracial one, reflective of the diversity around them. Their works show an ambivalence or even an indifference to their place in the racial hierarchy of the region, but a clear awareness of their access to inclusion and mobility, those Western expectations that I mentioned earlier. Now, these ambivalences did not go uncontested. Within the ILG, younger Jewish women had spoken out for years against the exclusion of Mexican women from their union, criticizing male leaders for their organizing failures and lack of militancy. In 1917, a group of women workers, who both the LA Times and the union referred to as girls, waged a wildcat strike, defying the city's harsh anti-picketing ordinance for over 5 weeks until they won a 15% wage increase. In June 1919, they waged another wildcat strike to demand a 44-hour work week, their employers obtaining an injunction based on allegations that the girls had been using, quote, terrorist methods. Furious that the strike had not been authorized by the ILG's General Executive Board, National President Benjamin Schlesinger came to LA to negotiate a settlement to the strike, dismissing the girls' efforts as, quote, hasty and ill-conceived. But right after he left, they walked out again to demand a minimum wage for women workers. And these were likely the same girls who made their way to Covina during the citrus strike. The local media became absolutely obsessed with them, particularly Esther Cooper, the, quote, woman leader of the strike, who also worked in the garment industry. She's up here in the top right corner. In one particularly salacious profile, the author leered at Esther's, quote, dark skin and the keen cut of her big mouth, disparaging her looks as well as those of other, quote, trousered women whose very curly hair was, quote, bobbed in the approved Bolsheviki manner. She then compared Esther, who left Ukraine at 16, to Mary Anton, writing that, quote, America is not her promised land for haven, but for havoc. There were clear parallels in the coverage in Covina of the Covina deportation to rhetoric coming out of Washington, D.C. in the same weeks, where the Senate was holding its first hearings on the threat of Bolshevism in the United States. The hearings featured the sensational testimony of Reverend Dr. G.A. Simmons, who offered his firsthand account of the revolution in St. Petersburg, which, as you can see in this excerpt, claimed that the, quote, Yiddish of the East Side, who he labeled apostate Jews, comprised the, quote, predominant element of the Bolshevist movement in America. But to go back for a second, I don't think the local media's obsession with these Jewish women, the, quote, ladies who wear red, who see red depicted here, this is Ida Rothstein and Lillian Goodman up in the corner. I don't think this can be explained without considering the gender trouble that their activism caused. As mostly young, often unmarried women, they transgressed the norms of monogamous marriage, feminine modesty, and the gendered logic of the separate spheres that the boosters promoted. These were not helpless immigrant mothers, as many Jewish philanthropists imagine them to be, nor were they the feminine dependents upon which male trade unionists based their claims to the family wage. These radical Jewish women asserted themselves as equal, even superior to their male comrades, advancing their own notions of femininity, rooted in working class solidarity and courage in the face of repression. But the disciplinary practices wielded against them cast that behavior as dangerous and subversive. The specter of the Jewish Bolshevik prefigured as a young, childless, trouser-wearing Jewess. As I document in the book, this same gendered specter came to haunt Jewish unions and other Yiddish-based organizations in the months that followed the deportation. Within the ILG, the conflict came to a head after a leadership election in which the members of the LA chapter voted out all of the incumbents and began to mobilize a general strike. The ILG national office sent out an investigator who charged that communists in the union were stirring up trouble, just as they had been in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, where, quote, bent on rule or ruin, the communists had, quote, stooped to every means, no matter how foul, to cast aside more mature men with broader experience, and immediately revoked the LA chapter's charter. The new leaders insisted they were simply trying to democratize their union by replacing existing executive boards, which, as you can see in these photos, were composed almost entirely of men, with a shop delegate structure that would empower rank and file members, most of whom were women. Many of them were not members of the Communist Party, but supported a more inclusive, democratic union structure and were deeply dissatisfied with this gendered status quo. But in LA and across the country, militant women became the primary targets for complaints about decorum and disrespectful behavior. The first ones purged from the union when the ILG began expelling suspected communists from their rank. And while I don't have time to go into this in great detail, this pattern was repeated in nearly every Yiddish-based institution in the city. In the Arbiter Ring, in the Yiddish press, in the Yiddish schools, in the cooperative bakery I wrote my dissertation about, each was engulfed in nasty conflicts, haunted by that specter of the Jewish Bolshevik, and subjected Die Linke to their own, albeit nonviolent, forms of discipline. Perhaps in the Q&A talk period, I can talk a little bit more about the cooperative center that the communists built as these fractures opened up and the ways they collectivized the labor of social reproduction there. They were structured a lot like what Miriam described of the Medem Sanatorium. But suffice to say, the record of what remains of these conflicts in the archives is quite thin, as the few surviving accounts were almost entirely written by the men who labeled these girls troublemakers and terrorists. So how do we as historians make sense of these women and their beliefs? How can we understand their motivations, what animated them? To finish here, I want to turn to one of the very few windows that remains, and that is the work of the great Shifra Weiss. I have only found the barest fragments of Weiss's biography. She was born in Chelm and joined the Bund at age 15 after her father was murdered, distinguishing herself as a street speaker and attracting the attention of the Tsarist police. So she fled, settling first in Pittsburgh and then Chicago, where she published in the Freie Arbeiter Stimme and the Yiddish Arbeiter Welt, sometimes under the pseudonym A Hamisher Mensch. Then she moved to LA in 1917 and helped found a singing circle to provide Jewish women opportunities for group learning and self-expression and an autonomous space to contribute to the radical movement. In 1921, they renamed themselves the Progressive Musical and Dramatic Union and staged plays by Yaakov Gordon, Sholem Asch, and Peretz Hirschbein. You can see they were more gender balanced by them. They're up in the corner here. Weiss was also a founding member of the city's first literary circle, the Schreiber Club, which included writers Joseph Katzenoghi and Loon Mattes, who we read before. Perhaps the most distinguished among them was Chaim Rosenblatt, who was a member of Die Junge in New York. And like Die Junge, this group sought to forge a distinctive Western American style that would give voice to the unique experiences of Jews on the Pacific coast. Those ambitions were reflected in the club's choice to rename themselves Die Gruppe Mairev in 1924, the Group West. You can see them all in the picture. This picture here, Rosenblatt is in the middle with the white hair, and Weiss is standing on the left with the bob. Around the same time, however, Weiss was said to have become, quote, active in the camp of the Jewish communists, and as far as I can tell, sort of expelled from Mairev. And that is about where the archival record of her existence drops off. Most of the anthologies she appears in offer no additional details other than that she, quote, died on her way to Florida in 1955, which is its own kind of hell, I suppose. And I can't really find her in the census or in city directories. All that remains of her is her written work. So as we wrap up here, let's turn to that now. Beginning in the 1920s, she starts writing poems about love and marriage and the possibility for more equitable gender relations that the revolution opened up. The first of her poems that I could find is called Heint, or Today. This is translated here who is the translator here? Yes, Amelia Glazer, that's what I thought. Here she is dismissing the models of femininity offered by old women, those who are, quote, sitting Shiva for yesterdays which are gone, probably tut-tutting about young women like her who wore trousers and cut their hair short. She has embraced today, my soulmate, her own self-respect and self-love, allowing her to embrace her lover today and plant tomorrow's healthy seed. I feel like this feels very modern, telling herself and other women to sort of stop listening to those old hags scolding themselves and trust yourself and love yourself. It's a nice little pump up talk. The second one here, Tsumman, I had to call in a favor to get this translation together because it was very difficult for me to decipher. And a big thanks to Jessica Kurzane for helping me out here. But a couple of things I notice. First, in the second stanza is this line about this iron life, and what she says in the third about the life of the flesh has restructured my bones. In my reading, these lines are about organizing and radicalism, which is to say embracing dialectical materialism, the life of the flesh, engaging with industrial workers and street organizing. You know, she has no more time to think of silly things like oiling her body and dressing up and dancing. But I also think you can read this life of the flesh as about sex and carnal love, maybe sort of baby making, transformation, a life of the flesh there. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. Second thing to notice here is the line at the end about red chuppahs. I chewed on this one for a while, but I think it's actually pretty straightforward. With the red modifier, she's endowing the traditional religious symbol of the bridal canopy with radical meaning. And with the plural, red chuppahs, waving over many heads, she is making marriage a collective project, right? That social reproduction isn't just about individual families and individual single family homes, that marriage and family life is collective and should be collective, right? Sort of rejecting those traditional norms of gender and domesticity that Esther Cooper and her trouser-wearing friends challenge so forcefully as well. So I am not a historian, or I am a historian. I am a historian, not a literary scholar, but it's pretty clear to me that for radical women like Weiss, being active in the communist movement involved a total transformation of self. Even the most intimate spaces and relationships became charged with the urgency of the revolutionary moment. Love, sex, and gender are intimately bound to political and social change, a reimagining of working class family life that was foundational to the project of building a new world. And so too was the labor of cultural production. Yiddish poetry, a crucial medium for awakening the masses to the possibilities of more egalitarian gender roles. You know, these poems may seem trite to us in sort of a modern way, but think of how like mind-blowing they might have been for women in the 1920s. Weiss embraces Yiddish literature's potential to offer what Moishe Olgin of the Freiheit called true revolutionary enlightenment, viewing herself as a pathfinder to the workers. And this is precisely what her colleagues from the group Mayrev disciplined her for. They rejected the politicization of Yiddish, criticizing writers who, quote, under the influence of political orientations and party allegiance, sought to, quote, achieve hegemony over the Jewish folks' masses. They founded a new group in 1927 they called the Yiddish Culture Club, pledging to remain, quote, seriously devoted to the Yiddish word. Schiffer was clearly implicated in their choice to do so, but she does not appear to have been fazed by their scolding, because in her first book, Ingang, she included these kinds of poems about love and revolution, as well as even sharper new works about biting social commentary. So I'll leave you today with my favorite in the volume. It's called California, and it's translated here by my dearly departed friend, Herschel Hartman. This is just the first half. But she begins here by offering a searing portrait of the history of violence and conquest in the region, right? There's no romantic imagery here of the boosters, sort of primitive peons being civilized by benevolent padres. She also takes a shot at artists too here, right? Arguing they had been complicit in this conquest. Their paintings and poems, quote, of sea sap, of golden oranges, of fields, palaces that bloom and grow, presenting fantasies that spread across the world. In this central stanza on the middle column, we can see she's saying the job of the writer is not to spin up these fantasies, but she, as she puts it, to pierce that romantic veil. I will stab the world's eyes and lay on the balanced scales the raw wounds at the feet of the hills. These raw wounds include hospitals full of sick birds, health seekers who were dying from tuberculosis despite promises of the curative power of the, quote, air of oranges, But like the militant girls of the ILG, her main focus was on the exploitation of Mexicans in Southern California. In Vice is telling the beauty and the majesty of California, all its riches, all its pleasures depended on the exploitation of Mexican workers and their families. My favorite line is in this third column here, capital draws its gold from their bones, right? So this poem reads as a rebuke of writers who ignored such injustices and rendered portraits of the regions without including the, quote, endangered lives of Mexicans in their work, as well as those who excluded them from their organizing. This is certainly a saucy poem. I have a feeling she was taking some shots here at people, possibly those organizers in the ILG or members of the Yiddish Culture Club. But at a moment where Los Angeles and other American cities are under siege by federal agents, with thousands of our immigrant neighbors being snatched off the street by masked thugs, doesn't this poem track for you? Isn't there truth to this conceit? Like, hasn't she captured something about the conceit of Southern California and of American life? Okay, so I'll leave it there. I just want to say that when we leave radical writers like Shifra out of our literary history of Yiddish, we lose all the insight her work provides. I don't want to make it seem like every Yiddish-speaking woman in LA was a radical or a communist. That's certainly not the case. CPLA was always a very small cadre group, and those involved suffered tremendous costs. Physical violence at the hands of the police, incarceration, the threat of deportation, which in turn fueled their militant activism. But when we write women like Shifra and Esther Cooper out of our histories, we reinscribe that marginality and retrench that exclusion. By instead centering their stories, we can see this longer history of Jewish otherness and racialization, and how intimately bound the specter of the Jewish Bolshevik was to gender and labor and the carceral logics of settler colonialism. So I'll leave it there for now, and I hope you read the book. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Thank you so much, Caroline. I think that, you have sold many copies of your respective books to people in this audience. I am also looking forward to seeing what grows from the seeds you each planted. I can't wait to read future scholars' work on Jews and race outside of New York City, the Medem Sanatorium, Shifra Weiss. Maybe there'll be a whole Shifra Weiss revival inspired by this talk, and also the question of sort of the city and the forest. Again, hi, I'm Elena Hoffenberg. I'm moderating this keynote. I would be remiss if I did not direct all of you who might be watching on Zoom to the Q&A function, which you can find on the bottom of your screen, and you can pose your own question to our two keynote speakers. I will take moderator's prerogative and ask a question that sort of invites both of you to comment on what you presented as well as what you heard. I was really struck by the tensions in these two talks about what role work should have in the future. That's represented in this literature, that's represented in these actual sort of social projects. So, Miriam, I heard, about Shabbos as a taste of Olam Haba, where there is no work. There's no work to be done, but also the Medem Sanatoria being organized around returning appropriateness and dignity to work. And then, Caroline, I heard, I saw these beautiful posters that promised a future without work, where the oranges would just leap forth from the grounds. Children would just spring forth clean and dressed. In your, even the poem, imagining sun-drenched cottages with just cut lawns. Who cuts the lawn? They're just cut. But at the same time, the poem by Shifra Weiss that sort of redeems the question of the work today in planting tomorrow's seed, she doesn't seem to recuse herself from carrying out the work that is required to cultivate that seed. So I'm curious for both of you, how are you thinking about what world is imagined in the future in these works? What place should work have? What value does labor have? Is it something we need to get away from or something that we embrace and reconfigure? And if there are any other points of similarity or conversation that you would like to pick up on from the other's presentation, please take this chance to do so.
So there is really, in Yiddish children's literature of the secular left, we are seeing a number of sometimes very closely related, sometimes very divergent political ideologies. The socialism of the Bund, but also labor Zionism, communism, just plain Yiddishism. And there are times when these all kind of track with each other, and there are times when there's a sort of maximal contrast. And I have to say that, looking at it from 35,000 feet, at all of them, I think that in general, there is a real celebration of labor. There is an embrace of work as having dignity and centrality, but there's a sense that the worker needs rest and should not be exploited, whether it's conceived of as a Sabbath rest or put in terms of health and the idea of anima sana in corpore sano, a healthy mind in a healthy body, which was part of the kind of guiding ethos of Miriam. There is a sense that too much work or the wrong kind of work would have a warping effect. A great sort of test case for this, I did mention the doggy Leipzig, because I've translated all 12 of the Leipzig stories. Those will be out very early next year with SUNY Press. And Leipzig is adopted by the family of Berel der Operator, Berel the sewing machine operator, who is a hard worker, who takes his wife Molly and his kids, and then Leipzig sneaks along, their dog sneaks along to picket outside the shop when the bosses decide to extend the workday to 9 p.m., which is clearly going to be very exploitative for the laborer. Leipzig loves being part of this family of hard workers, but in chapter 2, almost immediately after his successful adoption, he goes through an existential crisis because he cannot figure out how to make himself useful. All of his needs have been provided for, and there's nothing for him to do. And that's profoundly worrisome to Leipzig, because work is the activity that confers dignity upon everyone, even if they are not human.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. It's really, really interesting. And I think you've clocked something very important about LA's kind of civic imaginary, which is a sort of post-work world, an empire of leisure, as one of my colleagues writes about it. And actually, that's kind of what I see happening in some of the Yiddish literature. There is a whole world of literature where they're very much claiming exactly what Miriam just described, this kind of that true dignity is found in that hard work, but it's often sort of a chronotope of the past, of past lives. So Katzenogi's poem starts with this image of being far from the narrow streets of New York, from Pittsburgh smokestacks, right? That's a life once led, which again, I think speaks to this sort of inherent recognition of upward mobility. And so, the boosters are offering the same thing. I mean, that poster of the guy with the orange fields, that's not for a factory owner. That's for like someone working in a meat packing plant in Pittsburgh, right? Or Pittsburgh, maybe not, but whatever. Come out here and that the doldrums of work will be done by someone else. You won't have to see it. You won't be part of it. You can find somewhere else to land. So, I want to be clear, and as I talk about in other chapters of the book, the Jewish unions and Jewish workers are still very much cultivating a working class identity, but it's a Jewish working class identity. The tension between their sort of universalism of the working class and the Jewish working class is pretty acute because they're trying to figure it out. And whereas in Eastern Europe, that manifests as Jews being sort of the bottom, right? They're doing the most unskilled work. They're not becoming factory workers. They're almost like a lumpen proletariat because they haven't gone into the factories yet because they're being denied access to those spaces. It's almost like the reverse is happening here, where there's an awareness that they're going to be the clerk at the factory. They're going to be the boss at the factory, and they're not going to be down in the trenches doing that doldrums of work. So it is a sort of unworked future. I mentioned this or glanced at this in the talk, but I guess I'll mention it now. Within the Communist Party, that manifests in really interesting ways. So the second half of this chapter is actually about women in the Communist Party, where the specter of the Jewish Bolshevik manifests in a very particular way, which is that the party is consistently scolding the Boyle Heights branch, the Jewish branch, for the leadership of housewives. It's sort of like, why are all these housewives dominating? Because they're doing the kind of things that you were describing, Miriam, of they had a summer camp, they had after school programs, they had these classes, this kind of maternalist collectivization of social reproduction that the party is like, no, 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 you're supposed to be going to the factories. You're supposed to be organizing industrial workers. You're not supposed to be focused on families and children. This conflict literally reaches the national level at one point in the late 1920s. Now, admittedly, the fans of the CPUSA will know that's when they're going through this major shift in what's known as a third period, where they're embracing sort of going to the factories and embracing Black workers. I don't really want to dwell too much on that, as much as to say that the way that manifests here is they have this huge LA controversy that percolates its way up to the national. And the final report basically says the problem here is you're letting housewives dominate your party, and that these housewives are not sufficiently political, and that you need to stop doing all these things. So they tell them they should close their cooperative bakery and they should close this summer camp. The women, of course, do not listen. But I think what I see there is at least an attempt to sort of reckon with these ambiguities around class and to think about their neighborhood, which if any of you have been to Los Angeles, one of the most sort of, there aren't tenements. There aren't these sort of crowded, densely packed urban neighborhoods where there's these signifiers of class identity. They all look like suburbs. Even the quote ghetto of LA, people have single family homes with cars parked in the front. And so I think what these women are trying to do is reckon with their own embourgeoisement, if you will, and find ways to express a politic that is collectivist and is counter, but it is focused on sort of women and families. So, yes, I appreciate your comment, Elena. I'm not sure how they imagine the future. Historians, we don't like to talk about futures, but it was certainly one without work. And they're trying to sort of figure out how to keep that politicized, how to keep that consistent with the rest of their organizing.
Yes, thank you so much. These are really, I think, generative answers that spark new questions. I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have been posed in the Q&A. And another reminder to those of you who are watching on Zoom, if you would like to pose a question to our speakers, please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. I'll group together some of the questions that were posed to you, Miriam, and sort of you can, given the time remaining, maybe pick a few strands to highlight and carry forward. So one is about the secular impulse to write children's literature in general. And then another question is about how Fichman himself conceptualized gendered language, like Nechama's cooking. Is that something that's also understood as work in this context? And then from Jessica Kurzane, I wonder about teaching children about work when childhood is perhaps a time when you don't have to work and care is taken of you, also typically in a gendered way by a mother or a woman caretaker. Does dignity of labor need to be taught in a specific way to children because they are not always expected to be laborers? And then this is now for you, Caroline. Is an empire of leisure about returning to a childlike state? Is there something childish about upward mobility? And another question sort of about the longer history of Jewish children's literature. When it stops being written in Yiddish, do these questions of labor change? When Jewish children's literature is written in the Soviet context, do the questions about labor change differently? So Miriam, take a few moments to respond to whichever of these strands. Oh, and another question about the role of the forest as a space outside civilization. So questions about genre of children's literature, questions about the sort of social reproductive labor of children's literature itself, and also the spatial element.
Sure. So I will get to as much of this as I can quickly. I will say that I discuss these Sabbatarian tales in chapter 3 of my book, and I get to Yuri Soul's writing about the events of the Holocaust for children in chapter 9. So that's a big span between Fichman and Soul. But the and so they're coming in very different places in my overarching argument. But what I do think is the through line there is that these different kinds of storytelling, one of which is much more fairy tale like and romantic and has fewer sort of reality markers, and the other very realistic coming from Yuri Sul. But both of them are asking, what does the past mean? And specifically and distinctively, what does the Jewish past mean for the Jewish future? Because Sul is, when he writes the story, the little Sholem Aleichem, about a boy who has the self-appointed task of bringing the only remaining volume of the collected works all around the ghetto during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And then when he is finally taken down by a Nazi bullet, he isn't killed because the bullet lodges in the book that he has strapped to his chest under his garment, which, by the way, is a kapota or a kaftan, which is also interesting. We find out that the story that stops the bullet is Baranovich Station, and that becomes an intertext. Sholem Aleichem becomes an intertext of this new story by Yuri Sul. So he, in his own way, is asking, what is the significance of a tradition, even if it's an entirely secular literary tradition, as we move into a post-Holocaust Jewish reality? Let's see, a question about Nechama's labor in the kitchen. So one of the really fascinating aspects of not only this story, but the Lobzik stories, so many of these children's stories that come from different points on that ideological spectrum that I mentioned, is that there is an almost universally shared ideal of being able to put women into the kitchen as homemakers with control over the domestic sphere, while their husbands, their menfolk who are husbands, represented as husbands, are out in the world as wage earners. And this corresponds neither to so much of the Ashkenazi Jewish past, nor the kind of leading edge of radical politics. And it's very curious to me that this is still a vision that is given so much value in writing for children. So the deal that Lipa and Nechama have is that Lipa goes out to these hamlets during the week, he patches, he turns coats, and Nechama is home taking care of the children. If she runs a little store or has some other wage-earning activity, we never hear about it, but every Friday she has the children clean, bathed when he gets home, and the cholent is up cooking, and the rest of the food is prepared, and that is their bargain. So I think that it's very notable as part of what I call a framework of world making, of trying to kind of nudge the world in a certain idealized direction that turns out to be actually very bourgeois in the midst of all of this radical ideation that is otherwise going on. There's a particular regressiveness with respect to gender that we don't see along all of these other axes, political axes, in this work. To Jessica Kurzine's excellent question, so much of this children's literature, whether it's what emerges from Miriam and just kind of describing the whole project of the sanatorium, or the chapter that I have about the Yiddish construction of girlhood, where girls wander and go on adventures without coming into any particular kind of danger by virtue of their being female, and then they're able to return home. So much of what's being constructed in this work has to do with protecting children from work and imagining childhood as a time of leisure, and that goes hand in hand with long, compulsory, widely available education, which of course is one of the really important developments in the West over the 2 centuries that lead into the flourishing of this literature in the interwar period. So leisure for children at all is a kind of world making, the idea that children don't have to be laborers, but then as you speculate, we could think in terms of adult leisure, a life of leisure, what we see depicted on those posters, the orange groves that Caroline showed us, that does become a kind of functional childhood where difficult things are done for you. And that's just kind of taken for granted. So I want to think more about that question, but I'm going to pause here and maybe I'll come back to some of these after Caroline has her say.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Caroline, let me add a few more questions from the Q&A to your plates before you present. There are many resonances between what you're describing in LA and the more study case of Jewish labor organizing in New York City. So I would love to know how you think about the resonances between these 2 coastal cities. How do you think about these dynamics as not just big city USA dynamics, but part of a global change in conditions of labor and a sort of specter of revolution around this time in the wake of the First World War? So again, the question is an empire of leisure about returning to a childlike state. And then something that was described as a question that might be too hard, but I anticipate you'll have something very interesting to say. What is going on with the concept of a Jewish working class? And I also want to pick up on one of these comments and invite you to talk more about your own conditions as a laborer, your involvement with labor unions formally, but also in the work of your scholarship, depending on the labor of others, working collaboratively, working with different institutions. So yeah, thank you for responding to these questions.
For sure. The first thing, just because it's top of mind for me, is I do want to be clear, and you gestured at this, Miriam, but this debate about Yiddish schooling in particular they're precisely calling out that bourgeois conceit. So this comes from the great Paul Mishler, but communists had a very different vision of childhood. And all this stuff about keeping this precious stage of life where children have to be removed from the world and given a life of leisure, that is exactly what they're rejecting. Because they're saying it belies the reality of working class childhood, right? Poor families, kids don't get raised in a life of leisure and refinement. Kids don't get separated. They don't get cared for. And they don't not work. And so it is precisely that attack that the communists are leveling at the Arbiter Ring, specifically in Los Angeles, but not exclusively. This idea that we should try to prepare kids for a future of radical activity and not engage them in the class struggle now. So communist schools, the Communist Party, the Young Communist League, which was for roughly 16 to 25-year-olds, they were put in charge of the Young Pioneers, which are the kids under 16, and given all the autonomy and agency. The Young Pioneers ran their meetings just like Communist Party meetings. They called each other comrade. They passed motions. I mean, there was an attack, like a forceful ideological attack. And so if a Jewish communist were here, I think they'd be calling out the bourgeois conceit of a lot of these questions. And I just want to be real about that this whole notion that, childhood was to be cared and nurtured and taken in and taken out of the world is exactly what they were criticizing, which is why in those pictures of the specter of the Jewish Bolshevik, you see these teenage girls. They sent them out into Black neighborhoods to do street speaking. They were the ones getting beat up by the cops. That is all an extension of this logic of we don't protect our children from the world. We get them out into the world and engage them in the class struggle now. So I just want to say that. Okay, couple other things coming to mind. These are all really hard questions, as you reference. I want to direct one question to Jules in particular about how this is informed by my own labor organizing. My impression is that most Communist Party histories, most labor movement histories approach this through masculinist frames and essentially take people seriously as ideologues. Right now, part of that is because of this sort of elite bias. We don't have the voices of rank and file people. We don't understand how rank and file people understood these conflicts. We have these men who wrote these like long ideological riffs about the third plenum on who's what and all that kind of stuff. And anyone who has looked at the Communist Party reels that were released in 1999, they become insufferable. I mean, these men are insufferable. The way they report things, the way they describe what's going on, you're just like, good God, man, say what you mean. And so the moment I always relate to is I was looking through these reels, this LA controversy is happening. There's all these memos back and forth. And then I start to notice this one name and I'm like, Globerman. And then I page back a few pages and I was like, oh, Globerman. And then I page back a few pages. And it was this moment of like, oh my God, Globerman is just a pain in the ass. He's just that guy who comes to an organizing meeting and takes up a ton of space and talks all the time and causes controversy everywhere he goes. So what I am trying to do with this framework of the specter of the Jewish Bolshevik is get at those affective dimensions. Because any of us who have weathered organizing spaces, any of us who have been involved in our unions, any of us who have dove into the work of community building and collective organizing can tell you that some of these things are not about principle at all. And oftentimes we dress up what is essentially interpersonal rivalries or vibes in this way that makes them far more significant and serious than they are. I've written this book, and this gets to your questions about my labor, as a contingent faculty member who has had to reapply for my job every year since I finished my PhD. I have written this book over the course of 10 years on the weekends, uncompensated. It's not part of my job. And I think that all of us here need to seriously think about the ways that the traditional job that we're all supposed to have is gone. It just doesn't exist anymore. And so the work of writing a book like this is no longer sort of incentivized or part of the life cycle of people getting their PhD today. Now, I don't want to scare all our graduate students on this. Keep doing it. But just to say, like, I think that frees us up in a lot of ways to write books the way that feel right to us. And to rather than, I gave away a lot of my intellectual property. I published on Mapping Jewish LA for many years. That work is out and free. I started that work at a moment where information wanted to be free, where that was the kind of modus. There was a lot of open source work happening. The AI bots crawling all over the internet have changed that quite a bit. But I did that instead of publishing a bunch of articles in scholarly journals that no one would ever read. I made a choice there. And I think I would encourage everyone here to think about those choices differently, to think about where you invest your time and your energy, and where you let it go. And for me, my involvement in my union was part of that process of making choices. Because I believe that we're at a moment where the academy is crumbling down around us. And if we don't build our own collective spaces, what is the point, right? So that is why I'm so delighted to be part of this conference, just to give y'all some credit, all the organizers here, all the folks who put this together. As Miriam referenced before, this is the way through as far as I'm concerned. We carve out our own spaces where these traditional hierarchies are a little bit flatter and where we trouble ourselves less with who's got the chair of who's what, and think more about the collective work we want to do together, and the conversations we want to have. So I guess I'll tie it up there.
That's a beautiful ending. And I will just add on, the collective work continues with all of us as readers. So to anyone in the audience who wants to learn more about these respective projects, again, Miriam Udel's book, Modern Jewish Worldmaking Through Yiddish Children's Literature, came out last year, and Caroline Luce's book, Yiddish in the Land of Sunshine, will come out this summer. Thank you to the coordinators, the organizing panel of Farbindungen. I would be remiss if I did not draw attention to a link that was just shared. As we speak about academic labor conditions, there is a petition to try to save Yiddish at Harvard, which may be one institution, but a very paradigmatic institution to which other colleges looked, and we can collectively defend Yiddish there. And as a reminder, the next panel will begin in 40 minutes. So please join us again in this wonderful virtual space shortly later today. And a virtual round of applause again for our two keynote speakers, Dr. Miriam Udel and Dr. Caroline Luce. Thank you so much.